Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I particularly talk to the Future of Cities programme. In terms of the committee, we've talked about flexible cities and ways of defining flexible cities and urban livelihoods. What I'm really talking to today is particularly the response to relatively high levels of urban crime in the Caribbean, and particularly the Caribbean, but across Latin America and the Americas as a whole. And this has really been noted by governments, regional and international agencies over the last 10 years, with high levels of reported crime, particularly levels of homicide across the Americas. And a report in 2007 by the UN and the World Bank highlighted urban violence as a single most important hindrance or roadblock to forms of economic and social development within the Caribbean itself, primarily related to increasing levels of informal or narco trafficking. So what I will talk today for the next 40 minutes really is about my research in the Caribbean, primarily on my ongoing research in Dominican Republic, but also glancing to work that I did as a postdoc with Colin in Jamaica, and I've sort of added to that since then. In terms of sustainable development, I'm particularly interested in social sustainability, social policy and forms of urban governance. And why the Caribbean? Why bother with the Caribbean? Well, one is because clearly the World Bank has highlighted it as a place where urban violence is a particular problem. Secondly, the Caribbean, if you look at the various range of figures, and stats can tell many narratives you want to and don't want to look at, but the Caribbean is amongst the highest urbanised areas globally. In terms of regional levels of urbanisation, there are a series of relatively small islands with very high levels of urban populations. So in some ways you're looking at a condensed laboratory, if you will, of urbanised societies in small compact areas. So the key themes I'm looking at will be sustainable development, particularly social sustainable development, urban violence, looking at examples from Kingston, Jamaica, primarily at events in Kingston in May 2010, which in many ways brought the Caribbean and high levels of urban crime to the international attention, but also raised the issue of, is an island society, Jamaican society, particularly Kingston, a sustainable city form, city structure? One of the things that comes through the research fits in very well with wide research by scholars in Latin America, looking at the everyday levels of violence and normative forms of violence, where maybe visitors to a society are struck by the high levels of crime, high levels of so-called no-go areas, which have become a normative part of urban existence. And clearly a common sense approach will say this is not a sustainable way to develop urban societies. I've also focused on ideas of urban vulnerabilities. So the phrase human resource weakness is filtering throughout various UN and NGO reports, in that in cases of high impact, whether it's an earthquake in Haiti or high levels of crime in Bogota or Kingston, Jamaica, the human resource base, if you will, is unable or has difficulty coping with these high levels of environmental impact or political or socially disruptive impacts. Clearly, the UN, 10 years into the Millennium Development Goals, have looked at ideas of how development is progressing along the certain indicators in the majority urban world, and we can look at that to extent, particularly in the ideas of so-called slum living or informal dwelling. But overall, I'll be looking at the ideas of security and urban governance within the Caribbean, but really looking at that to the wider Americas region and the UN and World Bank responses to economic development and levels of violence. I'll insult everyone by showing a map. I'm focusing on Dominican Republic and Jamaica in the centre of the Caribbean Sea. Just a comparative, Jamaica's a population around 2.3 million people, just under a million or just over a million people living in Kingston, the capital. Dominican Republic, a population of coming up to 10 million people, of which around 2.5 million people living in Santo Domingo. So they are highly urbanised societies, but in both societies, the majority of the urban population are living within the two capital cities. So in terms of background, we won't again go over well-known ground, but in terms of the Brundtland Commission's sort of fourfold definition of sustainable development, I'm particularly interested as a social and urban geographer in the final, or the points 3 and 4. So clearly, you know, the standard definition of sustainable development in terms of intergenerational equity, or at least not compromising the future, compromising the ability of future generations, looking at social, economic and biophysical sustainability. But I'm particularly interested, as I said in the third point, intergenerational equity, ideas of contemporary social justice and social equity. Sustainable development isn't always about the future, it's about the here and now, and particularly looking at levels of social equity, but spatial equity within contemporary cities, within the Americas and within the Caribbean in particular. And I think a couple of geographers in the audience, the idea of space and spatial equity will ring a bell. In that, implicit in the Brundtland Commission is a notion that sustainable development has to be transfrontier. So when we're looking at cities, it is implausible just to consider the urban boundary. It's how does a city mesh with the outlying areas, whether they be defined as rural or whether they be out with the metropolitan, provincial or city jurisdiction. And that's very important when you look at levels of governance and implementation, if you will, or enforcement of forms of social justice. I think, Idalina, in your talk, you said you get these. I was at a seminar Idalina gave, and she said you get these figures all the time. So this just for Idalina, just to the well-worn figures. But it's particularly in terms of my interest in looking at how urbanisation impacts upon the global south. And so clearly 2/3 of current population expansion is absorbed by cities globally. We are within a global and urban majority, but 95% of demographic growth is occurring in the urban global south. Cities have been pinpointed in terms of the lead sites for sustainable initiatives to be implemented and monitored and sustained, if you will. And all the wider literature, I'm interested in ideas of urban adaptation and resilience, particularly within the sphere of urban governance and social policy. One of the loose link, well, not a loose link really, Scully's work in the mid-90s had looked at clearly at all the work of new urbanism in the States, and there's good old Celebration with its white picket fence and very strict levels of social governance, you know, so that new urbanism comes with regulations attached, and it quite clearly fits in Hobbesian ideas of sovereignty, that really sovereignty doesn't mean freedom for all, it means very clear restrictions upon the majority, upon maybe the minority or majority, to ensure some form of freedom for the majority within a certain area. So I won't focus on there, but what Scully does look at, says, okay, when we look at these new urbanist ideas or ideals, whether it be Celebration or in this case Seaside in Florida, one of the earlier developments of new urbanism in the 1970s, Scully suggested that one cannot help but hope that the lessons of Seaside and of other new towns now taking shape can be applied to the problem of housing for the poor. That is where community is most needed and where it has been most destroyed. Well, Scully was referring in principle to the North American European axis of urban development, but I'm particularly interested in how ideas, or at least the rhetoric of sustainability, fits into the urban global south, and particularly in this case, in the context here within Jamaica and Dominican Republic. So I guess anyone who listened to the day programme, which probably, given the audience, is probably a lot of us here, will maybe have come across the May 2010 news of Dudas Coke, essentially a story coming out of Kingston, Jamaica, itself a city that has been troubled by high levels of urban violence really since the 60s and 70s in particular, but really became to world attention in May 2010. When the community don stroke informal, and I'm on record here, so be careful, haven't I? Business person, someone whose involvement within community politics and community informal economy has been questioned. But this incident really gave rise to the case of how can a city be deemed to be socially sustainable? How can it be governed effectively if, in this case, the supporters of Dudas Coke, the community leader in Tivoli Gardens in Kingston, in downtown Kingston, essentially his followers were able to take over a large part of downtown Kingston. And so we have the two aspects of informal governance versus formal governance. And on the world media stage, the informal governance, the supporters of Dudas Coke, a community leader, local don, has actually controlled not only the urban sphere in Kingston for, I think, 2.5 weeks, but also in some ways not controlled, but was dominant in the world media. And the news coming out of Kingston was of a city out of control. And so this is just kind of interesting in that it links in many of the aspects, would see at this extreme end of the informal economy, urban violence, and the strengths or weaknesses of informal governance in Caribbean cities today. Clearly, the Shower Posse is the group, the gang really that Dudas Coke was allegedly linked with, and clearly his links were matched up very directly to the current Prime Minister of Jamaica. But while the Kingston experience is in many ways extreme, it does show some of the problems of so-called sustainable urban development and how that can be really appear to be working well at the macro level or even the city level, but less so at the neighbourhood level. So when we think of Jamaica in terms of its political development, it has a model Westminster economy. In terms of electoral returns, the two main parties, the JLP and the PNP, have more or less come in and out of power in what seem to be democratically well-run, fair, clean elections since independence in 1961. But when we look at the micro level, when we look at the communities like Tivoli Gardens and Trenchtown, Jonestown, we see that each of these neighbourhoods are highly exclusive urban settlements. In that, in Dudas Coke's neighbourhood, Tivoli Gardens, that really since the 1960s has been a JLP, a Jamaican Labour Party stronghold, previously by Siaga and then by, not Patterson, the current...
head of the Jamaican Labour Party.
Yes. Gosh, sorry, it's gone. It will come back to me as I was going along. But essentially, you see in these each neighbourhoods, the so-called garrisons that Stone developed and Mark Figueroa has called them in the early 90s, you see return rates of over up to 100% for one political figure. So while the overall national result is one of working democracy, at the micro level, these neighbourhoods are intensely run along lines of clientelism and patronage. And so you had highly divided urban landscapes, in many ways socially unsustainable in the fact that there is high levels of exclusion and very little interchange between neighbourhoods, primarily along lines of political patronage, but also along lines of adherence to community leadership. So what works well within a neighbourhood in some ways at some times also leads to very highly divisive and arguably unsustainable urban social patterning and networks in the long term. Okay, I won't go through these too much. These are just a few quotes, and these are just images from a newspaper, the main National Gleaner, taken in March 2009. These are spread throughout the newspaper, but just show the incidents of those affected by murder, really, within Jamaica, within Kingston, actually, specifically. It just shows the levels of normal visual. I did a separate paper looking at the visual analysis of death within Jamaican press, and it shows how it appears throughout newspapers, and the media representation of death, and what seem like overt levels of violence become normalised and become part and parcel of everyday media correspondence. And you see increasingly there are monthly, well not increasingly, there are monthly roundups of a number of levels of murder. And so we have almost a tally of deaths per month as a monthly roundup, in this case, in the Gleaner. But again, it's just a reportage of untenable, well not untenable, but unsustainable levels of urban violence. Then it can go into irony. So a bloody start to 2009, 13 killed in 48 hours. And this is the part from the newspaper. The killings have spoiled efforts by the National Transformation Programme and the Peace Management Initiative to have a crime-free January. So within 48 hours, there were 13 deaths. And I mean, that is shocking, and it is a sick irony, I guess. But it does show that, there's a lot happening. The government is not sitting and just sort of trying to militarise out, if you will, or police out crime. It has a whole range of peace initiatives, and adopting various measures to try and address these levels of high levels of crime. But again, from bad to worse, if you go to the Kingston Public Hospital, you obviously all may have heard of ambulance chasers, insurance salespeople, I guess, in North America, or maybe in Europe as well. But here outside Kingston Public Hospital, there are touts for funeral operators. And so when a death has been recorded, the family are confronted by funeral operators who will offer bargains. So if you have your funeral service with us, we offer baseball caps, you have badges with the deceased names on. There are a certain type of high-level marketing to get this death business. And so, as a final line said, it's a very competitive industry right now, so you have to make it attractive at affordable costs. I mean, one of the few economic growth areas in Kingston, Jamaica are funeral services. But you can, the argument here is you just become immune to this type of reporting. But what is interesting here, and this was early as 2001, and this year is chosen because this was a year that the number of violent deaths surpassed the 1,000 mark. And the 1,000 mark was seen to be the watershed, if you will. And what is interesting, if you look at Jamaican political history, the elections in 1980 were seen as the high tide of civil political violence in some respects. But in 2001, the number of deaths, and that was 800 murders per year, particularly around the election time. But in 2001, the number of deaths passed 1,000. But we see here in how the government's recorded the perpetrators of violence. There's a very clear separation between those who are gunmen and those who are civilians. I.e., those living within the downtown neighbourhoods, those living within informally governed areas were seen to be not essentially full Jamaican citizens. They're somehow recategorised as gunmen, and those others perpetrators of violence who were not alleged to be part of a gang or an informal group were civilians. I mean, that might be in terms of domestic abuse, etc., etc. And so you see how society then becomes divided into those who are part of the formal government structure and they have all the benefits and access as a citizen would, and those who are living out with formal areas of government or policing, surveillance and control. I've did this graph a while ago, too long ago, and I wince every time I see it. Those who do stats in the room will be wincing even louder than I. It is a diagrammatic representation to show the report I mentioned at the start, 2007, the World Bank, UN, that really shows that the Caribbean, in this report, in the collated figures, is the most violent region in the world. And I think you can question, given the figures were coming from up to 2005, why the Middle East and Southwest Asia are right down at the bottom. But nevertheless, in terms of per capita murders per 1,000 population, the Caribbean headed the list. And that really gave a rise to temporary high-level media visibility in Economist, etc., and globally, but again sort of highlighted the Caribbean not so much as an area of Bob Marley, ganja, cricket, salsa, etc., but really a highly urbanised area with very high levels of crime, which were, in the World Bank, UN, governments and international agencies' point of view, restricting economic development. So it wasn't access to formal education, it wasn't access to safe drinking water, access to adequate medical services. It was high levels of urban violence, particularly in capital cities, which were restricting the development of local economies. And that is key when we come to see in the final sort of 20 minutes a case study from Dominican Republic of the government's response to what they perceive to be high levels of growing levels of urban crime. So these figures are collated from UN, primarily UN reports up to 2000. They are, again, another, not a happy set of slides, but it's a number of murder rates per 1,000. And if we look at the first 10 up here, am I blocking the screen, actually? Have I sat in the middle of all the slides without realising? But what I will show you, the first 10 there, Jamaica comes at rank number 3rd as the third most violent country in terms of murder rates globally. And Dominican Republic is 15th, the other case study there. I mean, those questions, again, those stats, again, are representative, and you can look a bit deeper into the figures and sort of pick them apart. But what it does show for Latin America as a whole, that 7 out of the top 10, if you will, murder states in the world are in Latin America. And it kind of just emphasizes what the regional and international agencies have been saying, that violence is a fundamental problem to all forms of development, really, within the Americas, particularly within Latin America and the Caribbean. So just moving to the sort of primary case study, I've been doing research in Dominican Republic since about 1992, and in the last 4 years I've been working particularly on urban violence, primarily because when I went back to go to do interviews in 2006, a 10-year follow-up to interviews that I'd done for my postgraduate work, I found that rather than ask people about immigration and forms of nationalism and discrimination that I had done in 1996 vis-à-vis Haitian immigrants within the Dominican Republic, when I went back to the same neighbourhoods, A, they were under curfew, and which made walking around doing interviews far more difficult, but B, people just talked about delinquencia. Levels of urban violence was what people were talking about. And yes, immigration was an issue, yes, access to employment was an issue, but it became very clear that while I was trying to talk about immigration and other aspects of politics, urban violence, the way that their residents' lives have been transformed, particularly in the last 4 years, was the key narrative that was being relayed. So that's a case of research changing to fit the reality. And so what I've done every 2 years, and we'll be going back in January, is carrying out interviews, so it's primarily ethnographic research, in Santo Domingo, in the capital city of the Dominican Republic, particularly in one neighborhood, in Villas Agrícolas, and just seeing how levels of urban crime have evolved, or how they've been impacted, particularly by a recent police initiative. And this police initiative is what I'm going to focus on. It's called Barrio Seguro. It's a safe neighbourhood policing initiative. And in essence, it's a rolling out of zero tolerance policing, nightly curfews within primarily, initially, 13 selected neighbourhoods in Santo Domingo. So we'll go through in a slightly more detail. It is the government's response to reclaiming those streets, to reflect, if we see what's happened in Kingston, Jamaica in May, it's the Dominican government's attempt 4 years ago saying this is not going to happen in Dominican Republic because we are going to militarise parts of downtown Santo Domingo and make sure that the government retains formal control of these neighbourhoods. And through interviews with not only with residents but with police officers and those in government, the notion of regaining control not only of downtown Santo Domingo but also implicit reclaiming Dominican sovereignty, reclaiming the state for the people, and in not so open or closed brackets, gaining votes, has been the key initiative, the key development initiative, I should say, for the Dominican government since 2006. And it's a highly visible, it's a highly media-friendly development policy, social policy that the Dominican government has been pursuing for 4 years consistently. And that just maps out that very close link that's been made between economic development and levels of urban violence within the Caribbean and in Dominican Republic and, say, Jamaica particularly. So a couple of weeks ago, José Armando Polanco Gomez, the Chief of National Police, there are weekly, every Sunday night, there are media, there's a half-hour government programme saying how well this zero-tolerance programme is doing. And so this is on Monday, the Chief of National Police gave a new set of stats, and he said that once again, there have been 200 arrests in the last month, that all the cases have been thoroughly investigated, all those guilty have been are being put through the courts. But again, he heralded, say, we're facing we're facing a new form of policing. We've modernised our methods and our forms of command. So we've seen in the last 4 years a real attempt to revolutionise, to modernise Dominican policing, and through new forms of policing or forms of zero-tolerance policing to kind of revolutionise and modernise the state. And we'll come back into that close link between modernity, technology and development that the government has made and sort of implicitly puts this within the policing methods it's employing. So Blanco Gomez, in his wider speech, argued that, not surprisingly, the police is there to respond to the demands of the security and to guarantee public order. And so, again, across the Americas and I think elsewhere, we see a very close link between ideas of security and ideas of development. And a developed nation or a developing nation is a secure nation, secure for its people, secure for economic development. And the plan is called, the program is called the Plan for Democratic Security. And it builds very closely on the 2002 plan by President Uribe in Colombia, again called the Plan for Democratic Security, where the Colombian government essentially did a full-scale militarization of Colombian state's territory to reclaim the state from the FARC and the drug cartels operating in Colombia. So its background is from two ways. In terms of its rhetoric, it comes very much from the Colombian plan, which is a I think probably billion-dollar plan by the Colombian government with help from various allies, primarily USA, to combat essentially a civil war fueled by drug cartels, etc. But it also fits into ideas of security in Dominican Republic. And if we look at this, the emblem that appears everywhere, it refers back to a kind of a bucolic past, if you will, where Dominican territory was safe, sovereign, nuclear households, mum, dad, 2 kids or 2.1 kids, etc. And this sort of emblem of secure Dominican, reclaiming Dominican space, reclaiming the streets, not only for the economy, but for family and for, in many ways, a mythical Dominican past, is part and parcel of this democratic security, Barrio Seguro, safe neighborhood program. Okay, and it's a major operation. It's the Attorney General, the Secretary of the State for Interior and Police, and the National Police. And really over the last 4 years, it has been the primary development policy, as I mentioned, for the Dominican Republic as a whole. It initiated in 2004, and I'll just show just to translate quickly a bit of Leonel Fernandez's first speech as president. He remains as a president of the Dominican Republic, but you can see making those links between reclaiming the streets, making streets safe, and reclaiming national nationhood or sovereignty comes through very clearly within Fernandez's opening address in 2004. So the Dominican Republic can't continue the way it's going. It can't continue with citizens insecurity, with a traffic of influences, and this, if you read the rest of his speech, relates to 2 key influences, both deemed to be bad. 1, clearly drug trafficking, 2, the influence of ongoing Haitian immigration to the Dominican Republic. And we'll see this policing policy aims to address both these directly by stamping out crime, drug trafficking, the informal economy, but also informally by restricting or more directly deporting Haitian immigrants, i.e. those people who are stopped and searched, who don't have identity papers during curfew or during the day, become part of the 2,000 Haitian Dominicans deported each year, many of whom, or majority of whom, will have legal right to be resident in the Dominican Republic. So you have a sort of a de facto deportation or anti-immigration policy operating at the same time as the zero tolerance anti-crime policy. So can't continue with the traffic of influences, with clientelism, with the illegal enrichment, with the abuse of power, with disrespect, above all, with a lack of gravitas or seriousness in everything. Let's build a new society, more solidarity, more just, more prosperous, more prosperity, more humane, more democratic, more transparent and more participatory. So you can see it's a presidential launch address, but it's also making very clear links between reclaiming the state, reclaiming the nation, and addressing certain of these bad influences. And there again is the Barrio Seguro safe neighborhood emblem. And again, every Sunday night there is a half-an-hour news show that gives an update of arrests. So it's just a tally showing how many people have been arrested for what type of crime, all under the umbrella of this Barrio Seguro program. So this is Santo Domingo, the capital. The kind of blurry map, but done by good old-fashioned cartographic pen and stencils, so I'm keeping it. The dotted line is essentially what the area that's been singled out initially in 2006 when the plan was launched, La Zona Norte, the northern zone, which didn't have a name until 2006. So the background story is the length of the city would probably stretch along the back wall. We're looking here at the colonial centre. We're looking at those 13 neighbourhoods that appear now in just behind my head. So these are the 13 neighbourhoods that are singled out, and the next map will show a bit more topography. But I should say, how are these 13 neighbourhoods singled out, on what basis? Well, these 13 neighbourhoods were singled out as the key sites where zero tolerance policing would be enforced. Each neighbourhood has around 15,000 people in, 10 to 15,000 people. So we're looking at between 150 to 200,000 people living in this neighbourhood. The city itself is around 2.5 million people, so it's a tiny minority. These traditionally have been the lower income neighbourhoods, but there hasn't been no statistics, there are no crime reports, so you really can't say that these are the highest levels of crime, they're just the lower income neighbourhoods. So there's an implicit link made between poverty and problematic areas. So if we follow through some of the work by Dijketch in particularly looking at French policing, what Dijketch argues is that what's happening in many contemporary forms of policing is that rather than address issues, a spatial matrix is used. So the policing initiatives will address areas. So by default, these areas become rarefied as problem areas, and those residents within these areas become problems themselves. And what we can see here in La Zona Norte, now in 2006, La Zona Norte didn't exist. If I were doing interviews in Gascue here, or even within the area in Capotillo or La Ciénaga, no one would really know what La Zona Norte was. La Zona Norte evolved as almost creating a ghetto in 2006 with this new policing program. So now when I did follow-up interviews in Gascue, people would say, well, we wouldn't go to La Zona Norte because it's a no-go zone. No one goes there. A few months beforehand, they probably have no real reason to go, but it wouldn't be saying no one goes there. And it's very clear how this spatial, if you will, reification of 30 neighbourhoods has created a new urban landscape. And in interviews with those in the office rather than in the police force operating, they do talk about creating a cordon sanitaire. So implicitly they're protecting those people living here, which are by and large sort of got middle income to upper income classes spreading out to the west, and by and large lower income residents here. But in many ways they're talking about a protective barrier rather than the protective barrier in some ways, but they also talk about cleansing these neighbourhoods. And in many ways the translation can be difficult, but the direct translation from Spanish is very, very direct. Cleansing neighbourhoods, cordon sanitaire. I've got the quotes in my paper, but they talk about it's a mass of problems that need to be dealt with in the most effective way possible. And these are type of, there's very little nuancing of the language, or maybe it's my poor translation, but very, very clearly address that these are the problems. It's these areas of the problems, and those who living in them are also by default part of the problem. Just to show you that in terms of these neighbourhoods, that the riverine neighbourhoods are primarily informal settlements without any, mostly without direct provision of water, etc. But a large part, about 2/3 of La Zona Norte, have formal planning, tarmac roads, access to should we say, the usual urban services when there's electricity. So that's just some of the topography. And this is kind of a useful diagram, or a cartoon that is proudly pinned in the office of the Barrio Seguro headquarters and was shown to me with pride. And it was when, just before there was a 13th barrio added, and so the 12 barrios is a mistake. But this was used to show this is what's going to happen. With intense policing, the residents of the Barrio Seguro neighbourhoods will be able to sleep at night, thus allow them to work with safety, with clarity the following day, and develop a local economy. And in interviews with government officials and with residents who are in favour, some in favour, some against, obviously, the argument was, well, we need this to be able to resurrect the economy, because how can we work if we're scared to sleep in our beds at night? So that's a very visual metaphor that was verbally expressed several times. So just in context, In July 2006, when the Barrio Seguro program was launched, there were 16,000 military and police officers were dispatched to these 13 neighborhoods. So that's the largest militarized mobilization of Dominican military or police since 1965, when there was a civil war, the April Revolution. And that involved an outright civil war between the Reds and the Blues, and it involved the invasion stroke arrival of US Marines. It made international news. So we have a comparison here whereby there was a militarization in 1965 for an out-and-out civil war, and then there's a militarization in the summer of 2006 for a police initiative on these 13 neighborhoods that have been defined as requiring reclaiming, as it were, requiring reclamation. So the dramatic transformation in the urban landscape, really since 2006, what the Net Barrio Seguro program involves essentially eventide curfews and essentially the stop and search. And one of the key aspects, which I mentioned earlier, is that if you're not carrying your cedula, your identity card on you, you essentially will be taken and arrested, put in prison overnight until you're proven innocent. And this has a direct impact upon those without cedulars or identity cards. Many low-income Dominicans will not have these type of form of qualification, but they might have people who can vouch for them. But it really impacts upon those people who have Haitian Dominican ancestry. And they might be fifth or sixth generation migrants who legally can claim Dominican citizenship, but who for a series of institutional and individual forms of discrimination have never been able to gain access to formal state papers. So you have within a population of 9.5 million, it's estimated up to 1 million people of Haitian Dominican origin who are stateless. They have never been, or majority have never been in Haiti, or they cannot claim Haitian citizenship, neither have they been granted Dominican citizenship. So you're looking at a floating population of stateless residents, and these are the people who in many ways are directly affected by the stop and search, arrest without the papers policy that come under the curfew. So there's 4 key points of the Safe Neighbourhoods programme I'm going to look at very briefly, and then sort of wind up and look at the overall picture of how this very particular programme fits into wider issues of sustainable development and social policy in the Americas. The first aspect of the policing programme is I mentioned at the start, the image, if you will, but the notion that the police would have to have national or international training, particularly North American training, to modernise those on the ground. So there 1,500 police officers were sent to police training facilities in North Carolina, New York State. And this was part and parcel of the program. It's saying, look, we have Dominican officers. The head of the police, Rancière, had said 40% of our current police force are moonlighting. 40% are operating as watchymen. These are security guards, essentially doing other jobs. And so 40% of the police force weren't actually doing their job, they were going elsewhere. And it's acknowledged, Polanco, again, although he was saying how wonderful the results are, only 2 weeks ago he said, yes, corruption is a problem within the police force. And part of this drive to at least show there's a transition and modernisation of Dominican formal policing was to have overseas or North American training. This fits in very clearly with the second point, in that those officers in the Barrio Seguro program have new uniforms. There's a specific uniform that, with the logo, it's an excellent branding process. It's a revitalisation of how the police look, and that way it's hoped how they operate. So the new Barrio Seguro police force had a new set of Harley Davidson motorbikes, new Jeeps. But what is interesting in terms of technology is that each Jeep was fitted with a laptop, and each officer, and the focus here was on community policing, had a GPS system. So there are kind of two key disjunctures of logic there. Firstly, it was in interviews with the police officers, an interview with Colonel Brown, who was the head of the Barrio Seguro program. And I just have to say to a side, when I had an interview with Colonel Brown, I was fairly scared. I wasn't scared. I was scared, yes, have that on record. You know, the Jamaican police officers have reputations. And I was there, and it's very easy to be a very cynical, wibbly-wobbly academic and saying, well, this is terrible. And Colonel Brown is absolutely the antithesis of what I expected. He was very self-critical of the programme. He was against terms about zero tolerance. He was well read on the literature. He actually was one of the most nuanced and, I mean, maybe he's well trained, but it was a very, very detailed interview and very reflexive on what he was doing. And he acknowledged straight off that yes, the problem with this spatially focused policing is that crime is displaced. So if you look at studies at Leeds University, studies in New York, you see that under Giuliani and Bratton, crime was displaced in New Jersey, or crime was displaced from another neighbourhood. So I think it's very easy for academics to be cynical, but Dominican police and many are doing what they perceive to be the best they can do at this time. So I just want to say as an aside, because it's easy to waft in and be cynical about everything. But in terms of technology, laptops, and police officers said, well, we have the laptops ready, but there's no data. We can't access anything. There are no databases. And the second point, a GPS system. Well, if you have a community police officer, why do you need a GPS system to work your way around your neighbourhood? But it fitted in with the image of a modernised, developed police force that had new jeeps, new bikes, but new technology. And that fits into the wider development rhetoric and practice that Fernandez and the government have been pursuing really for the last 6 years. And that has made, to many respects, made Dominican Republic in many respects the economic miracle of the Caribbean. So economic reports have said the Dominican Republic actually stands out in the region as an economically well off, or at least advancing, if you will, progressing society. Which goes into the thing, well, how we get high levels of urban violence matched with economic development, but that's something probably to discuss later. This last couple of points really, intensive surveillance, the curfew operates from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. For those people who've lived in Latin America, life generally happens outside. So what we find that while the streets become, in brackets, safer, you have not two kids and two parents inside. You have the average household size in the neighbourhoods I was working in was around 8 or 9, and the intergenerational, the here and now of intergenerational sort of relationships, etc., meant that grandparents were no longer observing the kids on the streets while parents are working or brothers are working. Everyone was inside very small houses every night. For more than is probably socially or emotionally healthy. So you had a transformation not only of daytime but of nighttime and social sort of structures, and that has had a massive impact upon how households operate. So that's just something that came through in interviews. So safe streets, but what social cost? Very sort of finally, explicit connections were made with immigration. So why is violence increasing? Well, some said it's since 2003, Dominicans who were arrested in the States have been deported directly to Dominican Republic, and it's been alleged that they can just sort of take their hard-earned criminal skills and operate them in Dominican Republic. Responses from residents of that is that they should be assisted and rehabilitated. And there is some evidence that crime increased as deportation levels from the States increased. Secondly, there is a clear link made between high levels of violence and Haitians. And I won't go into this too much, but it fits in with this anti-Haitian rhetoric that is pervasive, and it was part of my PhD and is very well documented, but how this meshes very neatly with zero tolerance policing within these neighbourhoods which have been rolled out across the country. So just really to conclude now, it's evident from reports and from a vast growing level of academic research that urban violence has been increasing across the Americas and remains a primary concern on social, political and economic perspectives. Clearly, not only regional formal economies are disrupted, but at a small scale, particularly when looking at household and neighbourhood economies, these are affected not only by high levels of urban violence in terms of channels of communications, where you can go, who you can work with, but also in terms of the police response. Surveillance, but curfews actually has had an impact, has a great impact upon local economies in the neighbourhoods I've been interviewing. Displacement of any space, as I mentioned, any spatially framed policing creates displacement. That's just what happens, really. But the fourth point, I think, is the most interesting. It stems back to the 2007 report, and there's a notion in the 80s to fix the economic ills, if you will, of the Americas or poorer countries, structural adjustment aimed to roll out forms of transforming economies to fit into a new neoliberal agenda. Now, what the World Bank and UN report said in 2007, what they've said since, they've highlighted the case of the Dominican Republic as separate from the wider mano duro or more intensive militarization programs in El Salvador or Colombia, but they've said the Dominican Republic program seems to be a very good way forward. This small-scale, intensive policing seems a good way forward to try and combat the problem of urban crime in the Americas. And there's a notion there that this kind of initiative, this policing initiative, can be rolled out across the Caribbean, across the Americas, in some form, if you will, of some sort of social adjustment. What are the problems today? Well, maybe this form of policing is not a quick fix, but a generic fix to be looked into, and it's currently being recommended by UN and World Bank. So thank you for that, and I'll finish.